Thank you, Chair. I would also like to thank the organizers for the effort that you've put in the conference and for inviting me. Um, when I was looking at the briefing for the session and the role that India is supposed to be playing, there seemed to be one question that had come true, which was under what circumstances might the country take a more proactive and collaborative role regarding the South China Sea? Seems like a lot of disappointment from India being the slow elephant that it is. But this question essentially captures the sentiment from a lot of India's friends and from a lot of nations regarding in this role in the South China Sea, which is essentially, are you ever going to do something? Will your actions ever match to the large country that you are and the role that you can play? But from where India is standing, it already is playing a more active role than it was willing to even consider 2 years ago. The problem is perhaps in the expectations that expectations in the role that the region wants India to play and the role India is willing to play. Even on the term region, there's a difference in perception, because when India says region, it essentially means its immediate neighborhood, which is South Asia and the Indian Ocean region, and where South China Sea is only a secondary area of priority for India and the Indian Navy. One good example for that is India in 2015 signed a joint strategic vision with the United States for Asia-Pacific and the Indian Ocean region, where India chose to keep the two theaters separate, purely for the role that it can and wants to play on each of these theaters. When we talk about the rise of China, we invariably talk about the role India can play in balancing that rise. India knows that there is a role to be played, but it has its constraints when that theater is beyond the Indian Ocean region. When that theater is beyond the Indian Ocean region, India plays a role from which it can actually stand to gain something. In the role that India has been playing in the South China Sea, it definitely has been more enthusiastic under Narendra Modi. As soon as Modi came to power in 2014, he began to mention the South China Sea in its speeches and joint statements. He said it in his first India-ASEAN summit and the East Asia summit. In his bilateral talks, he brought it up in the bilateral talks with the US, Vietnam, and the Philippines. India even referred to the South China Sea as the West Philippine Sea in a joint statement with the Philippines, which is the term preferred by the Philippines. India's also started showing up at regional meetings and institutions such as the Shangri-La Dialogue. India, on the other hand, stepped up its defense cooperation with Vietnam and to an extent with the Philippines, including lines of credit to purchase patrol vessels. Finally, Modi has turned the Look East policy into the Act East policy. The point is, an assertive China has not weakened India's presence in those waters, but strengthened it. The role that India isn't playing is challenging China directly in its activities in the South China Sea. And if that is what the expectations are, then India, unfortunately, is going to upset and disappoint its friends again and again. India has to take up a role that is sustainable, both in terms of resources capabilities as well as strategically. India is consistently dealing with acts of terrorism on its soil, one of which occurred just a week ago. On one of its military bases in Kashmir. There is great pressure on the current government to respond to these situations and stabilize the environment. When the entire Ministry of Defense is engulfed with such responsibilities, development in the South China Sea becomes somewhat of a distant noise. While there has been a conscious effort to increase India's role in the maritime domain under Narendra Modi, its priorities, India's threat perception strongly remains land-based. Its northern borders are its priorities and is likely to remain so in the immediate and near future. When India is struggling with such pressing domestic crises, it simply cannot react or lend a proactive hand in the South China Sea developments. So India has taken up a policy which it can sustain, which is through its engagement with the Southeast Asian nations. Role as a middle power. In India itself, there is the debate whether India is a middle power or a great power. But India definitely is a middle power in the South China Sea and perhaps more of a greater power in the Indian Ocean region. One of India's substantial contribution in dispute resolution has been its approach in resolving its maritime boundary issue with Bangladesh. Just like the Philippines, Bangladesh took India to court, to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and won the case. Unlike China, India accepted and honored the judgment despite losing large areas of its maritime claims. This ought to have set an example, but it didn't. India is usually slow in reacting was one of the first nations to release a statement in support of the tribunal judgment in July. India did not take sides on the dispute, not with China, nor with the Philippines, but it took a stand on the matter of principle, that India recognizes the judgment, India is in support of the UNCLOS, and that all nations must do the same. It didn't matter to India if China won the case or Philippines did. What matters was changing norms which will alter India's rules of engagement as well. When India is finally coming out of isolation and willing to work together with some of its friends around the globe, it just cannot afford to have a new set of rules and norms handed down. So India is doing what it is in its interest, protect the current security order where it can, and lend its voice where it's already changing. Finally, in terms of a collaborative role, India's role in the South China Sea depends on its relationship with Southeast Asian nations and less with other regional powers such as the US and Australia. So it does not matter if the US or Japan wants India to carry out joint patrols in the South China Sea or play some sort of a proactive role in the South China Sea unless it's a request made by its ASEAN friends. If ASEAN can unite in its decision and take a call and approaches India on a set of approach that it wants India to play, then India will definitely consider it. So far, India has acted in terms of its bilateral relationship with ASEAN nations, such as staying on in Block 128 of Vietnam's exclusive economic zone, despite poor economic prospects. If it's a UN decision, yes, India will participate. That is India's formal official stand, that it'll do a joint exercise only under the UN flag. If it's an ASEAN decision, India will definitely lend a hand, but not on bilateral requests made by extra-regional powers. Having said that, there is scope for greater cooperation, such as institutionalized bilateral maritime exercise with Vietnam or the Philippines. There is even scope to explore India-ASEAN maritime exercise, reinstating norms of behavior on international waters. That is a role India can play to make the established rules and norms stronger through engagements. On a concluding note, India may not have a coherent South China Sea policy, but it does have a strong Act East policy. India is and will be conscious of the South China Sea tensions derailing its pace of progression with ASEAN nations, and most likely do what it can best at the strategic level to keep those waters calm and stable. However, there will be a very limiting role that India can play in actual resolution of these disputes, which I understand is a negative note to end on, but it is the truth closer to reality. Thank you.